What is going on, chess YouTube? In today's video, I want to show you a really cool game played between a young Gukesh and a young Arjun Erigaisi in a chess.com Blitz tournament in the year 2020. And here we go. In the game, Gukesh opens 1e4, best by test, and Arjun Erigaisi goes 1c5, the Sicilian defense. From there, we have knight f3, d6, and d4, the open Sicilian. Then c takes, knight f6, knight c3. And here, most top-level players do go a6, the knight or variation. However, instead, in this game, Arjun Erigaisi does go knight to c6, and we do have the classical Sicilian on the board. Now here, the main line, of course, is bishop g5, the Richter Rauzer Attack, and that is what Gukesh goes for. The idea being you are putting immediate pressure on that knight on f6. You are threatening bishop takes f6, trying to double black's pawns after e takes or g takes. And of course, black is going to go e6, the main line. That way, if white takes on f6, he can recapture with the queen. But the drawback of this move, it does pin the knight on f6 to the queen on d8. Now from here, Gukesh continues queen d2. That is the main line. The idea is you want to go long castles and then either f3 or f4, starting a kingside attack, depending on what black does. Now here, black has a million different defensive setups. The two main ideas, you can just go bishop e7 and short castles, developing your king immediately. And the other idea is to delay castling and develop your queenside, perhaps with moves like a6, bishop d7, and so on. Now in the game, Arjun, he stars a6. That is arguably the main line in this Richter Rauzer attack. Now here, Gukesh, he does castle, long castles. And now, Arjun, how does he want to continue? Well, the main line is bishop d7, but there are a lot of other lines. In this game, he does go bishop e7. And this move is a little bit weaker than bishop d7. It turns out the moves bishop e7 and a6 don't synergize that well in the Richter Rauzer attack. And now here, white has the option to punish this move with a simple move, bishop takes f6, but instead Gukesh, he does go f4, expanding on the king side. All right, now Arjun, he continues bishop d7, a typical move in this line for black. He is delaying castling for now, and he will have the option of castling on the queen side later in the game if that turns out to be the safer location for the king. All right, now, in this position, it turns out Gukesh needs to act immediately. If he slow plays the game, perhaps with king b1, a3, and so on, then black is going to get an excellent game with moves like b5 and h6 and so on. Now, instead, Gukesh, he knows this. He goes for the immediate knight to f3. Now, the point of this move is twofold. First of all, you are getting out of the way of a future knight takes d4 move. That would simplify the game a little bit, and knight takes d4 is better after black goes bishop d7. That way he can follow up bishop c6 in the future if he wants to. So that is one idea, getting out of the way of knight takes d4. But beyond that, white is also threatening the e5 advance, and that would be extremely strong in this position. Now, for example, if black plays a simple waiting move, perhaps rook c8 or something similar, then white could go e5 immediately. That would be extremely strong. So with that in mind here, black, he needs to act fast, and Arjun finds the best way to get counterplay on the queen side. That, of course, is the very typical Sicilian defense move, b5, expanding on the queen side. Now here, white has a ton of different ideas. It turns out e5 is not only playable, it is the strongest move in this position. Of course, that was part of the idea of knight f3 played on the move prior. Now, instead of e5 immediately, white can also go, say, king b1, bishop d3, or the move played in the game by Gukesh. That is the move bishop takes f6. Now, bishop takes is a very typical move in the Richter Rauzer, of course. However, it wasn't necessarily forced. Now, here, of course, black has the option of recapturing with the g-pawn or the bishop. Now, if you take back with the bishop, that is a very simple tactical mistake. Of course, then the pawn on d6 does fall. The bishop needs to stay on e7 in this line, and therefore g takes f6 is really the only move for black in that position. Now, in this position, the pawn structure has completely transformed. This is a very typical Richter Rauzer pawn structure. Black has that giant mass of pawns in the center, as well as the h-pawn and the pawns on b5 and a6. Now, the biggest problem for black here, of course, is that king on e8. Castling on the king side is typically not a good idea in these lines. Instead, the king either stays on e8 or it goes castling long later in the game. And for example, black can, castle long, go h5, maybe h4, getting play on the king side, and so on. Now, white, on the other hand, he's typically trying to get some sort of play against this giant mass of pawns in the center and against the black king. Now, his two main pawn breaks in this position are going to be e5 and f5. Now, f5 is typically a little bit more common. The idea being you want to trade on e6, and after f takes e6, then all of these pawns on f6, e6, and d6 will be quite vulnerable. And from there are a million different ways that white can generate play. For example, f5, g3, bishop h3, knight e2, knight f4, and so on is one idea. There are a lot of different setups against black's setup here. All right, now, in this position, white continues bishop d3, a perfectly fine move, a very good placement for the bishop. Beyond that, moves like f5, king b1, and even g4 immediately were also playable. Now here, Arjun, he continues queen b6, giving his king the option of castling long on the queen side if he needs it. Now, Gukesh, he continues king b1, a very typical move, a good prophylactic move. And now Arjun, his two main options are to go long castles immediately or to get counterplay on the queen side with the move b4. And the move b4 basically commits his king to being stuck in the center for a very long time, as that pawn on b4 will be very vulnerable, and therefore castling long would not be recommended. Now, in the game, Arjun, he does castle long. Long castles is the move, a perfectly fine choice. And now Gukesh, he finally decides to get his play going on the king side with the very strong move f5. Again, the point of this move, white is threatening f takes e6 in the future, but he doesn't have to play that move immediately. Again, instead, he can continue to build up his game. Perhaps rook h to e1, knight e2 to f4, and so on definitely come to mind. Now here, Arjun, in this position, his best move is simply king b8, a very simple prophylactic move, getting his king off the semi-open c-file, setting up the idea of rook c8 if he needs it. Now, instead of king b8, he actually goes for the move king to b7 in this position. Now, Arjun is thinking his king will be safer on b7 as opposed to b8, but it turns out that is just not the case. Now, Gukesh, he continues queen to h6, flying in with the queen to the king side. h6 overall is a pretty good square for the queen, but Gukesh will have to be careful not to lose his queen on the king side. It could potentially be trapped later in the game. All right, now, Arjun, he continues rook d to g8, sliding his rook over the semi-open g-file, putting pressure on the weak pawn on g2. Of course, if g2 falls, white is going to be in a lot of trouble, so he has to find some way to defend it right here, right now. Now, in the game, he does go simply g3, blocking the g-file, a perfectly fine move, but the computer does say moves like rook h to f1 or even rook h to e1 are also playable, potentially gambiting the pawn on g2, but instead Gukesh playing very solid with the move g3. Now, from here, Arjun, how does he want to continue? Well, the computer again finds many different moves, and these Richter Rauzer style positions are just so hard to analyze for both sides, as both sides have a myriad of different options literally on every move. For example, the computer finds queen to c5, rook to c8, and knight to e5 to all be about equally good. Now, instead, in the game, Arjun doesn't play those moves. Instead, he goes knight to a5. And this move is a little bit dubious. I mean, what is the knight doing on the a5 square? Yes, it is eyeing c4, but on c4, it wouldn't really be doing that much. Yes, it does open up the c-file, potentially for a move like rook g to c8. But if you wanted to do that, why did you go rook to g8 in the first place? Now, beyond that, if the king moves, the knight may go to b7 at some point. But again, overall, knight a5, kind of a clumsy-looking move, and the knight is further away from the center of the board. Now, Gukesh, he continues, queen to h5, dropping back the queen one square to put pressure on the weak pawn on f7. Now, of course, Arjun is going to have to respond. In the game, he does go rook to g7, a perfectly fine move, but now the rook is sort of committed to being on the g-file for a while, and that could be a problem later in the game. Overall, his pieces are a little bit awkwardly placed, and now here, in this position, Gukesh has a brilliant move to seize the initiative. This one is a shocker if you're not familiar with these positions, but if you are a Richter Rauzer aficionado, you may see this move immediately. Now again, if you like puzzles, pause the video and try to find the shocker move for Gukesh. And while you're at it, go and smash that YouTube like button for more videos just like this, where I hold my breath for 20 minutes straight. All right, now, of course, the key move for white in this position is going to be e5, a temporary pawn sacrifice, and quite a brilliant one. The idea is after e5, then d takes, that is the strongest move. You actually give up your knight. Knight takes e5. The point being, here, I'm going to show it real fast. e5, d takes, knight takes, and if black takes the knight, then you go f6, hitting the rook and the bishop. The point being, after bishop takes, you have queen to f3, hitting the bishop and the king. Overall, the game explodes in white's favor. He would have a massive initiative. So that is the key idea. e5 right here in this position. Instead of that here, Gukesh plays a very solid move, very thematic for the Richter Rauzer. That is just the move knight to e2, intending knight to f4, again, putting more and more pressure on that weak pawn on e6. That is the weakest pawn in Black's position. All right, now here, Gukesh, Arjun Erigaisi, the other Indian superstar, he continues king to a7, getting his king closer to the queenside, and of course, freeing up that b7 square for the knight if he wants it. Now, knight b7 could be one idea, but again, overall, going knight a5 to b7 to maybe c5 is a very clumsy rerouting process for that knight. Now, Gukesh, he continues knight to f4, piling up pressure on that weak pawn on e6, and now here, Arjun, sure enough, he does go knight b7, so overall, wasting 1, 2, 3 moves just to get his knight over to b7, and it's not really obvious what that knight is doing on the b7 square, so overall, I feel like Arjun is just not as familiar with this sort of position as Gukesh. All right, now, Gukesh, he continues queen to h6, putting pressure on that rook on g7. How is Arjun going to respond? In the game, rook g to g8 is the move, and now here, Gukesh, he's got many different options as usual. The top lines, according to Stockfish, are rook h to e1, queen to h5, again putting pressure on that pawn on f7, and rook h to f1. Now, instead here, Gukesh, he starts to go down a slightly dubious path as well. In addition to Arjun, he goes knight to h5. Now, the idea behind this move, you are putting pressure on that weak pawn on f6. That pawn is now very vulnerable. But here Arjun, he just retreats, queen d8. He's defending f6, no real problems. And overall, Arjun is starting to fight back in the game. Now, from here, the computer actually says admitting your mistake and going back with the knight to f4 is the right idea. The knight, of course, is better placed on f4 than h5. However, here, Gukesh, he goes off the deep end and plays a madman's move. He goes b4, expanding on the queen side, trying to blockade Black's pawn on b5. Maybe he wants to go c4 or b4 in the c4 or a4 in the future, but overall, b4, you do not want to weaken your queen side like that willy-nilly. And here Arjun, he punishes this mistake immediately with a very strong move, e5, clamping down in the center. Now, this move, of course, is very double-edged. It does give up that d5 square. Of course, if white could get a knight there, that would be incredibly strong. But look at these two knights. This knight is 4 squares away from this square, and the other knight as well. This knight on h5, it's got to be, I don't know, at least 4 squares away as well. You have to do, I don't know, g4, knight g3, knight e2, knight c3, knight d5, and so on. So overall, e5 does give up that d5 square, but white is simply in no position to take advantage of that. And here, Black, he may even be threatening the d5 break himself in the near future. All right, now, Gukesh, according to the engine, the strongest way forward is a3, bolstering the queen side, perhaps intending rook h to e1 next. Instead, he does go bishop e2, retreating his bishop and trying to increase his control of that weak d5 square, and maybe putting a little bit of pressure on that pawn on d6. However, this turns out to be quite a bit weaker. Now, Arjun continues bishop c6. We can see his pieces are starting to coordinate perfectly. The bishop putting a tremendous amount of pressure on this diagonal here, and he is getting ready for that d5 break in the center. Now here, Gukesh, bishop d3. He's going back and forth with his bishop. He has no real plan. Now here, Arjun, it turns out he can go d5 immediately, but instead he first goes king b8, a simple prophylactic move. Now here, Gukesh, again, a3 is the right way forward, but instead he does go h3, gaining some space on the king side, and it's not really obvious what this does. Very importantly, this move does weaken the g3 pawn. Perhaps he wants to go g4, then knight g3, but overall, this plan is quite slow. And now here, Arjun, he finally breaks in the center with the move d5, blowing open the position. Now, of course, here, Gukesh, he is not down or out. He finds a brilliant tactical shot in this position. Again, if you like puzzles, pause the video and try to find the beautiful move right here. This one is simple. Even if you're a beginner, you may be able to find the beautiful shot right here. All right, of course, the move is knight takes e5, the temporary knight sacrifice. The point being, if you take the knight, you regain the piece immediately with the move queen takes c6. Of course, that pawn on c6 is pinned on the horizontal file to that bishop on c6. Now, instead of taking here, that would be a mistake. The right way forward is queen c7 or d6, just bolstering your bishop on c6. Instead of that here, Arjun, he goes bishop to e8, retreating his bishop, but this move is quite passive. As you can see by the eval bar skyrocketing on the left, here Gukesh is doing excellent, and he does find a beautiful way to proceed. Simply knight to g4, piling up the pressure on that very weak pawn on f6. What is Arjun going to do? Well, he spots that weak pawn on b4, and he does take it immediately. Bishop takes b4, winning that pawn. And again, it's not really obvious what b4 did for white earlier in the game. He's now losing that pawn, but of course, white regains the pawn immediately with the move knight h takes f6. Now we have bishop c3. Arjun perhaps trying to infiltrate on those weakened dark squares. The threat now could be, for example, queen a5, queen b4, then threatening queen b2 checkmate. Of course, Gukesh, he spots this. He jumps back with the knight. Knight takes d5, winning that pawn and putting pressure on the bishop on c3. Now Arjun, he continues queen to a5, flying out with the queen, defending that bishop on c3. Now we have knight takes c3, and instead of the immediate queen takes c3, Arjun plays the cheeky move queen b4, hitting the king first. Now king c1, and only then queen takes c3. Now here, Gukesh, he continues queen to f6, taking control of this long diagonal with the queen, guarding a1, and of course potentially forcing off the queens off the board. Now here, Arjun, he continues queen to a3, sliding his queen over, keeping those queens on the board, and of course, putting the king under a little bit of pressure. But Gukesh, he's staying cool, calm, and collected like the cucumber that he is. He just slides his queen back, queen to b2, blocking the check. Now we have queen a5, and now knight to f6, jumping up with the knight, pressuring both the rook on g8 and the bishop on e8. Now, where is black going to move his pieces? In the game, he does take on g3, rook takes g3, but it turns out this is a slightly dubious move, as white, in fact, does not have to take on c8. Instead, he plays an even more beautiful tactical shot. Knight d7 check. The discovered attack of the queen on the rook on h8 is the idea. And now, of course, Arjun, he has to take on d7. Bishop takes d7, but of course, now the rook on h8 does fall. Queen takes h8 is the move. Now the king moves king to a7, but now the queen slides back. Queen d4, hitting the king on a7. Now king b8 is the move for Arjun. Now we have queen e5, hitting the king once again. Queen c7, blocking the check. And now Gukesh does trade down into an endgame. Queen takes c7, then king takes, and now rook d g1, offering that rook trade. Now here Arjun, he tries to fight on. Of course, he is down significant material in this position. He has those two minor pieces and the rook versus the two rooks and the bishop. And beyond that, of course, Gukesh is up a whole pawn. He has the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pawns versus the 1, 2, 3, 4 pawns of Arjun. That is not looking good. So here Arjun, he tries to fight on rook to e3, but now the very simple move for Gukesh, king to d2, and look at this. The rook on the e3 square is getting trapped. It will be lost sooner or later. And with that in mind here, Arjun, he simply resigns on the spot on move 41 to Gukesh D, the new chess world champion. Wow, what a game between Gukesh D and Arjun Erigaisi in this 2020 Chess.com Blitz tournament game. Alright, Chess YouTube, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, smash that like button and check out this video right here, where I show you yet another incredible Gukesh D versus Arjun Erigaisi game. If you're a fan of Indian chess, you must check that game out. You will love it, and I'll see you in the next video.